Las Vegas is a city of secrets, but Jeff German spent 40 years dragging them into the light. He was Nevada's most feared investigative reporter, a man who survived threats from the mob and corrupt officials alike. But in 2022, he met a killer who didn't belong in the underworld. It was a high-ranking politician he had recently exposed. As he was being stabbed, the 69-year-old fought back, clawing the murderer's DNA into his fingernails. The final silent testimony of a man who refused to let the truth die with him. Help this channel grow. Like the video, leave a comment, and subscribe for more cases. This helps us a lot, thank you. To understand the collision that left a neighborhood stained in blood, one must first look at the two men who occupied completely different corners of the Nevada desert. In the red-tinted light of a Las Vegas sunrise, the city reveals its true self. Not the neon glitter of the Strip, but a vast, sprawling machine fueled by power, money, and secrets. Jeff German was the man who kept the receipts. At 69 years old, he was a relic of a dying era of journalism, a time when reporters wore out shoe leather instead of just scrolling through social media. He had spent 40 years in the trenches, moving from the Las Vegas Sun to the Las Vegas Review-Journal, and in that time, he had become the city's unofficial historian of corruption. German was a man of precision and silence. He lived alone in an upscale, quiet pocket of Summerlin, a suburb that felt a world away from the chaos of the casinos. His colleagues described him as a lone wolf, a bachelor whose primary relationship was with the truth. He didn't have a family to go home to. He had stacks of court records, anonymous tips, and a burner phone that never stayed silent for long. In the 1980s and 90s, he had gone toe-to-toe with the most dangerous mobsters in the state, exposing the hole-in-the-wall gang and the brutal underbelly of the casino industry. He had been threatened, followed, and intimidated, yet he remained the conscience of Las Vegas. He was a tall, lean figure who favored tailored suits and a stoic expression, moving through the halls of justice with the confidence of a man who knew where all the bodies were buried, both literally and figuratively. Then there was Robert Telles. If Jeff German was the shadow, Telles was the man desperately trying to stand in the sun. Born in 1976, Telles represented the New Nevada. He was a graduate of the UNLV Boyd School of Law, a practicing attorney who saw politics as his ultimate calling. In 2018, riding a wave of progressive reform, he was elected as the Clark County Public Administrator. It was a role that most voters barely understood, yet it carried immense, quiet power. His office was responsible for overseeing the estates of those who died without a will or without family, handling the homes, the jewelry, and the life savings of the departed. On the surface, Telles was the picture of suburban success. He had a wife, children, and a comfortable home with a swimming pool. He was active on social media, often posting about his dedication to transparency and fairness. He viewed himself as a rising star in the Democratic Party, a man destined for higher office, perhaps a judgeship or a seat in the legislature. He cultivated an image of a hardworking, empathetic public servant who was cleaning up an old, dusty corner of the government. But behind the polished LinkedIn profile and the campaign smiles, a different reality was festering inside the public administrator's office. By early 2022, the atmosphere under Telles' leadership had turned radioactive. Longtime employees, some of whom had served the county for decades, felt as though they were living in a panopticon. They claimed Telles was not a reformer, but a micromanager with a hair-trigger temper, a man who played favorites and fostered a hostile work environment. They spoke of secret allegiances and a professional environment that had devolved into something resembling a high school clique, fueled by rumors of an inappropriate relationship between Telles and a subordinate. These employees knew that in Las Vegas, if you wanted something exposed, there was only one name you called. They reached out to Jeff German. When German began his investigation, he wasn't looking for a murder story. He was looking for a story about the misuse of power. He spent months meeting with whistleblowers in dark corners of parking garages and coffee shops, listening to their accounts of a boss who had become a tyrant. For German, this was a standard assignment, another mid-level politician with an ego problem. For Telles, however, the inquiry was an existential threat to a man who had built his entire identity on the perception of being a good guy, The prospect of a Jeff German expose was equivalent to a death sentence for his career. As German began filing public records requests and asking uncomfortable questions, the two men's lives began to orbit one another in a dangerous dance. German was methodical, cold, and focused on the facts. Tellez was becoming increasingly erratic, lashing out at his staff and growing obsessed with the reporter who was digging into his life. He didn't understand that German couldn't be bought or bullied. He was a man who had stared down the mob. A local politician didn't scare him. But Tellez wasn't just a politician, he was a man who felt the walls of his carefully constructed life beginning to crumble. And in the dry, oppressive heat of a Nevada summer, that kind of desperation can quickly turn into something much darker. The first deep cracks in Robert Tellez's carefully curated reality didn't appear in a courtroom or a jail cell, but on the front page of the Las Vegas Review-Journal in May 2022. For months, the atmosphere inside the Clark County Public Administrator's office had been reaching a boiling point, a quiet, desperate kind of heat that only those trapped within the four walls of the government building could truly feel. Behind the heavy doors, employees were no longer focusing on the estates of the deceased. They were focused on surviving their boss. The catalyst for the explosion was a group of whistleblowers, long-term public servants like Rita Reed, who had finally reached their breaking point. They described an office culture that had devolved into a warring camp, a landscape of us versus them. They alleged that Tellez had transformed a once efficient department into a hotbed of favoritism and bullying. The complaints weren't just about harsh words, they were about a systematic dismantling of professional dignity. Employees claimed Tellez would single out those who didn't show absolute, unquestioning loyalty, subjecting them to public reprimands and a constant, suffocating level of surveillance. Jeff German was the man who caught their echoes. When he began his investigation, he was handed a treasure trove of internal grievances and secret recordings. These weren't just disgruntled rants. They were the sounds of a workplace in total collapse. The whistleblowers described Tellez as being obsessed with factions, rewarding a small circle of inner sanctum staffers while ostracizing the rest. But the most explosive element of the investigation involved a woman named Roberta Lee Kennett, a subordinate whom Tellez allegedly favored to a degree that crossed professional boundaries. The rumors of an inappropriate relationship were a wildfire in the office, but German needed more than whispers. He needed proof. That proof came in the form of a grainy, surreptitiously filmed video taken in a parking garage. The footage showed Tellez and Lee Kennett in the backseat of a car, a visual confirmation of the office gossip that Tellez had vehemently denied. For German, it was a crucial piece of the puzzle, evidence of a leader whose personal life was bleeding into his professional duties, compromising the integrity of his office. When German's first article hit the stands, the impact was immediate and devastating. It painted Tellez not as the progressive reformer he claimed to be, but as a petulant, insecure micromanager who was unfit for leadership. Tellez's response was a masterclass in psychological projection. He didn't issue a formal, measured rebuttal. Instead, he took to social media, launching a digital crusade against the man who had exposed him. He portrayed himself as a victim of a hit piece, claiming that German was a bully who was obsessed with his downfall. The timing couldn't have been worse for the politician. The primary election for his seat was just weeks away. In the high-stakes world of Nevada politics, a Jeff German expose is often a career ender, and Tellez was about to learn that the hard way. Despite his frantic attempts to discredit the reporting, the voters had seen enough. In the June 2022 primary, Tellez didn't just lose, he was humiliated, finishing a distant third. In a single evening, his political trajectory, the judicial aspirations, the dreams of higher office, was effectively vaporized. But Tellez refused to go quietly into the night. His obsession with German only intensified as he entered the lame duck period of his term. He spent his days stewing in the bitterness of his defeat, convinced that German and the old guard of the office had conspired to ruin him. His Twitter feed became a bizarre stream of consciousness. A series of attacks directed at German, calling him a hatchet man and mocking the reporter's age. He even posted screenshots of German's emails, trying to prove a bias that didn't exist. German, for his part, was unmoved. To him, Tellus was just another subject who didn't like the mirror being held up to them. He ignored the online taunts and kept working. He was already deep into a follow-up story. A second article that would detail even more allegations of misconduct and the continued chaos within the office after the election. He filed a fresh round of public records requests, seeking internal communications and emails that Tellus was desperate to keep hidden. For Tellus, this was the ultimate provocation. He was a man who had already lost his status, his future, and his pride. The thought of a second article, a final crushing blow from the man he hated most, seemed to be the tipping point. The digital war was no longer enough to satisfy his resentment. As the desert heat intensified in late August, Tellus' focus shifted from defending his reputation to something far more permanent. He began to study the reporter's habits, his home, and his quiet suburban street, preparing for a confrontation that would transition from the page to the pavement. Friday, September 2nd, 2022. The Las Vegas Valley is already beginning to bake under a relentless sun by mid-morning. In the Summerlin neighborhood, the air is thick with the scent of parched earth and the low-frequency hum of hundreds of industrial-strength air conditioning units struggling against the desert. This is a community of high-walled gardens and manicured xeriscaping, a place designed for privacy, for quiet, and for the kind of anonymity that money buys. At 10:30 a.m., the temperature is already climbing toward 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Jeff German is at home. For a man who spent his life chasing the loudest stories in Nevada, his personal routine is remarkably hushed. He is 69 years old, lean and physically active, but he moves with the unhurried grace of a man who knows exactly how much time he has left in his day. He has no reason to be on guard. His house, a modest but elegant property on Bronze Pebble Terrace, is his sanctuary. He is likely thinking about his next move in the Tells investigation, perhaps mentally drafting the opening paragraph of the follow-up article that would finally close the chapter on the public administrator's career. Outside, the silence of the cul-de-sac is broken by the low rumble of a vehicle, a maroon GMC Yukon, an older model slightly weathered by the Nevada grit, cruises slowly past the house. It doesn't belong here. It circles, its dark-tinted windows acting as a two-way mirror between a predator and his prey. The driver is patient. He has been watching. He knows the rhythms of this street. A figure emerges from the vehicle, parked a short distance away. At first glance, he looks like any other municipal worker or landscaper common to the suburbs. He wears a wide-brimmed straw hat, the kind worn by those who spend 12 hours a day under the sun, and a neon orange high-visibility reflective vest. Underneath, long sleeves cover his arms despite the rising heat. He carries a bag. To a casual observer, he is invisible, a background character in the suburban landscape. But he isn't here to work on the roads. The man in the straw hat approaches the side of German's house. He moves with a purpose that is both hurried and strangely clinical. He slips into the shadows of the side yard, near a gate that leads to the rear of the property. He waits. The desert heat is a weight, pressing down on the orange fabric of his vest, but he doesn't move. He is a neon silhouette standing in a blind spot. Inside, something draws Jeff German toward the side of his home. Perhaps he hears a noise, a gate latch clicking, a footfall on the gravel, or perhaps he is simply stepping out to check a utility box. He opens the door and steps into the narrow passage between his house and the neighboring wall. The transition from the cool, filtered air of the interior to the blinding glare of the morning is instantaneous. The attack is not a cinematic struggle. It is a frantic, brutal collision. The man in the straw hat lunges. There is no warning, no exchange of words, just the sudden, violent presence of another body in a space that should be private. A blade glints in the harsh light, a sharp, functional tool meant for a singular purpose. Jeff German, a man of nearly 70, finds himself fighting for his life in a space less than 6 feet wide. The pacing of the world shifts. The hum of the AC units disappears, replaced by the sound of scuffling shoes on desert rock and the ragged, desperate gasps of a man realized his mortality. German is thin, but he is not a victim who goes quietly. He has spent 4 decades fighting with words, and in his final moments, he fights with everything else. He reaches out. his hands clawing at the orange vest, at the long sleeves, seeking a grip, seeking to push back the weight of the man pressing him into the earth. He is stabbed multiple times. The intruder is relentless, striking with a focused, manic energy. The blade finds its mark again and again, in the torso, in the neck. German falls, the heat of the pavement rising to meet the heat of the blood soaking into his shirt. But even as his strength begins to hemorrhage away, his instincts as a chronicler of truth remain. As the attacker leans in, German's hands reach up, his fingernails digging into the skin of his killer. It is a microscopic act of defiance. He isn't just fighting to live, he is collecting evidence. He is ensuring that even if he cannot speak, his body will carry the name of his murderer into the laboratory. The man in the straw hat stands up. He is breathing hard. He looks down at the crumpled figure of the reporter, the man who had turned his life into a series of public records. The neighborhood remains silent. No one has heard the struggle. No one has seen the orange vest disappear into the side yard. The killer turns and walks back toward the street, his gait heavy, his head down under the shade of the straw brim. He returns to the maroon Yukon. The engine turns over with a familiar metallic growl. He pulls away from the curb, merging into the light Friday traffic of Summerlin, disappearing into the sea of SUVs and desert dust. Back on Bronze Pebble Terrace, the sun continues its ascent. The shadows in the side yard shorten. Jeff German lies still, his eyes fixed on a blue Nevada sky he will never write about again. He is alone. The blood on the gravel is already beginning to darken, drying quickly in the 100-degree heat. To the neighbors passing by, the house looks exactly as it did an hour ago, peaceful, prosperous, and secure. They don't know that the conscience of Las Vegas has been silenced. They don't know that for the first time in 40 years, Jeff German has become the story he was never supposed to tell. The only witness is the microscopic traces of skin and hair trapped beneath the reporter's fingernails, the final silent testimony of a man who refused to let a politician have the last word. Saturday morning in the Las Vegas Valley usually carries the heavy, sluggish hangover of a Friday night's excess, but on Bronze Pebble Terrace, the atmosphere was unnervingly frozen. Jeff German was a man of clockwork precision. His absence was the first alarm that something had gone fundamentally wrong. He didn't miss meetings. He didn't ignore his phone. He was a man who lived by the deadline, and when the sun began its climb toward noon on September 3rd, 2022, his silence felt like a physical weight in the newsroom of the Las Vegas Review-Journal. It was roughly 10:30 a.m. when the safety of the Summerlin suburbs was finally stripped away. A neighbor, moving through the routine of a quiet weekend morning, glanced toward the side of German's home, a narrow, gravel-lined walkway that served as a buffer between the residence and the heat-baked wall of the adjacent property. There, in the shadow of the house, they saw something that defied the manicured logic of the neighborhood. The body lay crumpled in the walkway. At first glance, the neighbor hoped it was a medical emergency, perhaps a fall or a sudden heart attack brought on by the punishing desert heat. But as they drew closer, the hope evaporated into a cold, visceral reality. There was blood. Far too much blood for an accident. It was pooled in the desert rock, stained into the beige stucco of the house, and darkened by nearly 24 hours of exposure. Jeff German was cold, his body already rigid with the finality of a life taken the day before. When the first 911 call crackled over the police scanners, the Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department didn't yet realize they were standing at the epicenter of a national firestorm. The responding officers found a scene that was as brutal as it was targeted. This wasn't a robbery gone wrong. Jeff's wallet was still in his pocket, his keys were nearby, and the interior of the house remained undisturbed. A silent tomb of investigative notes and tailored suits. This was an assassination, an execution carried out in the most personal of ways. In the newsroom of the Review-Journal, the silence that followed the confirmation was deafening. Reporters are conditioned to handle death. They spend their careers writing about tragedy in the third person, distanced by the cold mechanics of prose. But when Jeff German's name scrolled across the police wire as a homicide victim, the collective breath of Nevada's media was held. Executive editor Glenn Cook would later describe the sensation as a physical blow to the heart of the institution. Jeff wasn't just a colleague, he was the dean. He was the man who had seen the mob, the corrupt, and the killers come and go. And now, he was the one being outlined in white chalk on a suburban driveway. The community echo was a volatile mixture of grief and a very specific historical kind of terror. In a city like Las Vegas, built on the foundations of organized crime and disappeared witnesses, the murder of a reporter carried a heavy, ominous resonance. It felt like a regression, a violent jump back to the 1970s when the mob used car bombs to silence the press. The rumors began to move like wildfire through the casinos, the law firms, and the corridors of the Clark County Government Center. Everyone knew Jeff's list of enemies was longer than the Strip. He had spent 40 years ensuring that the powerful never felt entirely comfortable. But as the initial shock subsided, the focus of both the newsroom and the homicide detectives began to narrow with surgical precision. They looked at his recent work. They looked at the man he had dismantled in the weeks prior. They looked at Robert Tels, the public administrator who had spent the last 3 months lashing out on social media like a cornered animal, his vitriol becoming increasingly erratic as his political career turned to ash. The local atmosphere changed overnight. Journalism in Nevada had always been a contact sport, but now it felt like a war zone. Reporters began checking their rearview mirrors on the drive home. They looked twice at the SUVs idling on their streets. The fear wasn't just about Jeff's death. It was about the brazen, untouchable nature of the act. The killer hadn't waited for a dark alley or a midnight encounter. He had done it in broad daylight, in a quiet neighborhood during the busiest hours of a Friday morning. The detectives processed the scene with a grim, clinical meticulousness. They noted the lack of forced entry and the specific positioning of the body. Jeff had been surprised, perhaps lured into the walkway by someone he thought he recognized or someone who looked like they belonged. The forensic teams began the painstaking process of collecting what the desert hadn't already destroyed. They looked for shell casings, but found none. This was a blade crime. It was intimate, quiet, and required a terrifying level of resolve. As the sun set on that first day of the investigation, Jeff German's desk at the office remained exactly as he had left it on Thursday evening. There were piles of public records, a half-empty coffee cup, and a stack of notes for a follow-up story on Robert Tels that he would never get to finish. It was a visual representation of a life interrupted mid-sentence. The why was the only question that mattered now. Was it a cold case from the 90s seeking revenge? Or was it the man who had been tweeting his hatred for German just hours before the body was discovered? The suspicion toward Tels wasn't just a hunch. It was a gravity that everyone in the city felt pulling them toward a single maroon vehicle that had been caught on a neighbor's Ring camera. A vehicle that would lead the police directly to the doorstep of a public official who thought he was smarter than the man who caught the truth. The trail that led to Robert Tels was digital before it was physical. While Jeff German's body was being processed by the coroner, a different kind of forensic work was happening on the quiet streets of Summerlin. Detectives didn't have to look far for a motive, but they needed a machine. A specific, maroon-colored machine. They began canvassing the neighborhood, knocking on doors, and asking for access to the one thing that has replaced the eyewitness in modern America, the Ring doorbell camera. The footage was a jigsaw puzzle of grainy, wide-angle clips. Piece by piece, the detectives reconstructed the movements of a vehicle that had no business in the cul-de-sac. It was a maroon GMC Yukon XL, an older, boxy SUV that stood out against the late-model European cars and electric vehicles common to the area. On the morning of the murder, the vehicle was seen circling the block, lingering near German's home, and finally pulling away just minutes after the estimated time of the attack. The investigation hit a surge of adrenaline when the detectives cross-referenced the vehicle with the public records Jeff German had died for. They discovered that Robert Tels, the very man German had spent months exposing, drove a vehicle that was a near-identical match to the one on the surveillance tapes. The gravity of the case shifted instantly. This wasn't just a lead, it was a collision course. But the police weren't the only ones hunting. In an extraordinary display of professional loyalty and investigative grit, Jeff German's colleagues at the Las Vegas Review-Journal began their own hunt. They weren't just mourning, they were reporting. On Tuesday, September 6th, news crews from the paper staked out Tella's home. They watched as a man who had spent the last week tweeting about his vindication now huddled inside behind drawn blinds. Then they saw it. Parked in the driveway was the maroon Yukon. The reporters photographed the vehicle and sent the images to the police, effectively forcing the hand of law enforcement through the power of the press. On the morning of Wednesday, September 7th, the silence of Tell's suburban neighborhood was shattered by the rhythmic, heavy thud of tactical boots and the barking of commands through megaphones. The Las Vegas Metropolitan Police Department arrived with a search warrant that would tear the politician's life open. They didn't just want the car, they wanted the work clothes seen on the man in the straw hat. The search inside the Tellys' residence was a descent into the desperate mind of a man trying to outrun a deadline. In the garage, detectives found the maroon Yukon, but it was the items hidden inside the house that provided the most visceral connection to the crime. They found a pair of sneakers, expensive, high-end shoes that had been meticulously washed, but the killer had been hurried. In the deep recesses of the seams and the underside of the tongue, forensic technicians found what they were looking for: microscopic traces of human blood. Then came the discovery of the costume. Inside the home, detectives found a wide-brimmed straw hat and a neon orange reflective vest, the exact items worn by the killer to blend into the suburban landscape. But Tellis had tried to destroy them. The hat had been cut into tiny, irregular pieces, a frantic attempt to render the evidence unrecognizable. The vest, too, had been shredded. It was a pathetic, mechanical attempt at a cover-up, the work of a man who understood the law but didn't understand the relentless nature of forensic science. While the physical evidence was being bagged and tagged, the most damning piece of the puzzle was being solved in a sterile lab across the city. The skin cells and DNA that Jeff German had clawed into his fingernails during his final struggle were compared against a sample taken from Tellys. The result was a mathematical certainty. The DNA found on the dead reporter belonged to the public administrator. The investigation reached its climax as Tells realized the walls had finally closed in. As SWAT teams surrounded the house for a second time that evening to execute the arrest warrant, Tells retreated into his bathroom. He didn't come out. The standoff lasted for hours. A high-stakes drama played out in front of news cameras and neighbors. When the police finally breached the door, they found a man who had tried to take the easy way out. Tells had inflicted self-harm in a desperate, failed attempt to avoid the handcuffs. He was wheeled out of his home on a gurney, his face pale and obscured by an oxygen mask, surrounded by the very fake news reporters he had spent months disparaging. He was no longer a rising political star or a reformist official. He was a suspect in a cold-blooded assassination, a man who had been caught by the very DNA of the man he tried to silence. The trail of the maroon Yukon had ended at the Clark County Detention Center. The investigation had moved with a speed that was rare in homicide cases, fueled by the collective outrage of a city and the tireless work of a newsroom that refused to let their colleague become just another unsolved mystery in the desert. Robert Tells had thought he could kill the messenger to stop the message, but as he was led into a jail cell, the irony of his situation was absolute. By killing Jeff German, he had ensured that his own name would be written in the one place he feared most: the permanent, unerasable record of the truth. The trial of Robert Tells, which began in August 2024, was a spectacle of the surreal, a final desperate attempt to overwrite reality. Standing before the jury, the former official didn't just maintain his innocence. He spun a labyrinthine conspiracy theory that felt like the plot of a low-budget thriller. He testified for hours, claiming he had been framed by a shadowy alliance of local police, corporate real estate interests, and the old guard from his own office, all supposedly in retaliation for his reformist agenda. He attempted to explain away the DNA under German's fingernails and the blood-soaked shoes in his closet as elaborate plants left by professional saboteurs. But the jury saw through the fiction. The physical evidence was a mountain that his words could not climb. After nearly 12 hours of deliberation, they returned a verdict of guilty for first-degree murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 20 years. As he was led away in shackles, the man who tried to control every narrative found himself silenced by the very system he once vowed to lead. Jeff German's desk is finally clear, but the silence in the newsroom is far from empty. He didn't just report on the rot in Clark County. He became the final, irrefutable piece of evidence needed to cut it out. In a town where neon lights usually blind the public to the truth, German proved that integrity has a heartbeat, one that even a killer's blade couldn't stop. Robert Telse wanted to bury his scandals. Instead, he buried himself. The truth didn't die on that Summerlin driveway. It just found a new way to be heard. If you are finished watching, you're a real fan of true crime. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and give it a like. See you in the next video.